Hello YouTube. So in my last video, I talked about what makes Geo the worst element in Genshin Impact, and changes I would make to change it if I could. In the comments, a lot of you guys asked what I think would be the second worst element in Genshin. My answer to that question is very easy: CRYO. So today, I'm going to talk about what I believe the flaws with CRYO are, and why I think it's overall an overrated element. But first, if you could do me a favor and subscribe to this channel, that would be greatly appreciated. I'm really hoping to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of this year. But with that said, let's jump right into this. Alright, so in order for us to have this conversation, we need to talk about CRYO's reactions. Excluding Sprawl and Crystallize, CRYO has 3 reactions: Superconduct, Freeze, and Melt. First, let's take a look at Superconduct. So as we know, Superconduct is the reaction between CRYO and Electro. When Superconduct hits enemies, it reduces their physical resistance by 40%. Now, 40% resistance shred is an extremely powerful effect. It's basically the 4-piece VV effect, but for physical damage, and unlike VV, this can actually be refreshed from our field. 40% resistance shred is a 30% damage increase if the enemy is starting at 10% resistance, or 20% if their resistance is already in the negative. If their resistance is starting at 40% or more, then this is a 40% damage increase. So this is clearly a powerful effect. So what's wrong with it? Well, the most obvious problem is that it's only for physical damage, and we don't exactly have great options for physical damage right now. For characters intended to be physical DPS, we have Eula, Razor, and Xinyan. Razor and Xinyan are 4 stars with a very limited damage potential, and the Eula is decently strong, but has a ton of practical issues that result in her not actually being that good in practice. So, we have a lack of quality on-field physical DPS to utilize this reaction. But adding on to it, Resistance Shred is a way of increasing damage that you can have multiple units on the team taking advantage of, since it's a debuff on the enemy and not a buff to your character directly. But there isn't a single off-field physical damage dealer in the entire game to take advantage of this with. With Superconduct, by default, you have both CRYO and Electro, and since your Electro and CRYO damage isn't being buffed by Superconduct, that's leaving a lot of damage on the table. So realistically, what I believe we need to make Superconduct teams better is 1, a really good on-field physical DPS, with 2, Electro and CRYO units that are good at applying their element, but primarily deal physical damage from our field. But if I were allowed to change the reaction directly, I would have Superconduct reduce physical, CRYO, and Electro resistance all by 40%. Now, let's say you are playing a Eula team and using units like Raiden and Rosaria with her. Now, they are doing a lot more damage and making a notable improvement to her team. But even furthermore, this would enable a bunch of new team options for CRYO and Electro, even without using physical at all. As an example, in Aggravate teams, bringing a Nemo for Resistance Shred and buffing can be very difficult if you want to use Nahida. If Superconduct worked like this, you could bring, say for example, Diona instead of a Nemo for the 40% Superconduct Electro Shred, while also buffing your on-fielder by 200 Elemental Mastery and providing both shielding and healing. Since her off-field CRYO application is very slow, you would be getting CRYO applied onto Electro instead of the other way around, thus not losing any aggravates. This is just one example of how beneficial this change would be, and how it would make CRYO a much better element. And I don't think it would be overpowered by any means, since aside from Quicken teams, you wouldn't really be able to pair it with any other reactions anyway, so you'd pretty much be playing teams dedicated to this. But now, let's talk about Freeze. As we know, Freeze is the reaction between Hydro and CRYO. It does exactly what the name suggests: freezes enemies in place. When an enemy is frozen, they will have CRYO as the visible aura on them, and there will be an underlying Hydro aura as well. This makes it possible to swell both Hydro and CRYO, so that you can have both elements buffed if you were using someone like Yelan as your Hydro, whom you would want doing as much damage as she can. So Freeze is great for crowd control, since frozen enemies literally can't move. It's great for buffing 2 elements together, and it's also great because the Blizzard Shred provides an extra 20% crit rate when enemies are frozen. The problem with Freeze is that it doesn't work against Barsis. When I say it doesn't work against Barsis, I don't just mean they don't get held in place by being frozen. I mean that your auras also just straight up die. So if your Hydro unit is meant to be a noteworthy portion of your team's damage, or if they apply Hydro frequently, this can result in messing up your rotations and making things more difficult and having it extend your rotations in order to get a proper buff set up. You will also lose the 20% crit rate from Blizzard Strayer. And if you are relying on the enemy being frozen for them to stay in place from the reaction, like for example for Ayaka's burst, now you have to risk the enemy simply moving out of the way. The flaws against bosses are very relevant because you will rarely ever see an Abyss Chamber without any bosses at all. We have this right now on the top path of floor 12, but this is it's pretty rare that you actually see an Abyss that's an ideal scenario for Freeze. So, what could be done to make Freeze better? Well, Freeze's flaws are too deeply rooted into the way the reaction itself works for it to be fixed with new characters or artifacts or anything like that. So, I would go straight to changing the reaction. What I would have is have Hydro and Cryo coexist like Electro and Hydro do with Electro Charged, even if the enemy can't actually be frozen. This would pretty much fix everything except the issue of not being able to crowd control bosses with Freeze. But honestly, that's fair. Being able to hold bosses in place like this would trivialize them too much, so I can see why that's not a thing. Now, because I know if I don't mention this, someone is going to bring it up, but yes, Shatter is part of Freeze, and you could say it's technically a Cryo reaction, but I don't think we need to explain why Shatter isn't good. Now let's talk about Melt. Melt is the reaction between Cryo and Pyro. Cryo onto Pyro will be reverse Melt. It will not fully consume Pyro of the same gauge. It will multiply the Cryo damage by a base of 1.5, further increased by your Elemental Mastery. Pyro onto Cryo is forward Melt. Pyro will fully consume Cryo of the same gauge. The damage will be multiplied by a base of 2, further increased by your Elemental Mastery. Amplifying reactions are typically viewed in high regards because they provide a large multiplier to your damage. So, what's the problem? The main issue comes to buff setups. Melt teams will almost always want to use Bennett, and since Bennett applies 2U Pyro, it will take 4 instances of Cryo application to have a Cryo aura left over, this making Swirl setups extremely difficult. You could use your Anemo before Bennett, but that will likely result in scuffed buff up time. Furthermore, there's not really any good options for off-field Pyro application other than Zhongling, and since Zhongling applies Pyro so fast, it will be nearly impossible to get a Cryo Swirl during Zhongling's 14-second uptime, resulting in even further scuffed buff uptime. And adding on to this, Zhongling takes about 2 seconds of Bennett's uptime, so depending on the full team, this can result in your Cryo unit not getting very good Bennett uptime. And since Zhongling is extremely energy hungry, you will also want to funnel some Bennett E particles to her, which will also likely result in extending the rotation and lowering your DPS. Comparatively, let's look at Vaporize. Vaporize is the reaction between Hydro and Pyro. Pyro on Hydro is reverse Vaporize, and Hydro on Pyro is forward Vaporize. With Vaporize, buff setups are much easier. Here, Bennett's 2U Pyro is actually a good thing, since it will make getting Pyro Swirl so much easier. The off-field Hydro units that these teams use are Xingqiu and Yelan, and they have a very easy time getting rid of Bennett's Pyro application and getting a Hydro aura applied, making swirling both elements fairly simple. Also, since Xingqiu and Yelan don't snapshot, you don't need to worry about using them after Bennett and lowering his buff uptime for your main DPS. So with Melt, we don't really have a way to simplify the buff setup like we can with Vaporize. I think the best way to improve this would be to get a more ideal off-field Pyro applier than Zhongling. Perhaps something that procs off normal and charged attacks at frequent intervals like Yelan or Xingqiu. And I specified charged attacks so that Ganyu can use it too. But with the Pyro application being procced by normal and charged attacks, you would be able to control it so that it isn't getting in the way when trying to refresh your buffs with Cryo Swirl. This wouldn't fix the issue of Bennett's 2U Pyro being difficult to get through, but if this new Pyro unit would be good enough, maybe we could use Shanahan instead of Bennett so that we don't have the problems that come with him either, or you could just accept that you're going to have to work around the issues that come with Bennett. Let's also cover forward Melt. As mentioned, forward melt is pyro onto cryo. The main issue with forward melt is that pyro will fully consume the cryo aura, meaning you'll need to quickly reapply cryo before your next instance of pyro application. This is extremely fragile because you could end up applying pyro before cryo can be reapplied. And if this happens, it'll be nearly impossible to get cryo to take over as the aura again, thus resulting in reverse melt instead of forward. The only unit that can really utilize forward melt well is the Luke when paired with Kaya and a cryo-infused Kazuha. This works with him because Kaya applies cryo pretty fast, especially at Constellation 6 where he applies it roughly once per second. And also because you can time the Luke's pyro application by reading in the proper amount of normal attacks between each skill use. However, from what I've been told by some Diluc owners who have tried his team, even this can be difficult to pull off because the timings are pretty tight, resulting in a difficult rotation. And other pyro DPS pretty much can't use forward melt well at all. Hu Tao and Klee apply pyro way too fast. The Ormia is ranged, so she can't make a good use out of Kaya since he needs you to be hugging the enemy in order to hit. You can make forward melt more consistent by using freeze, since the pyro would now have to get through both hydro and cryo, making it way harder for pyro to end up as the aura. But this is pretty much never worth it over what you could have gained over using another unit in that slot instead of a cryo unit, especially since freeze just straight up doesn't work against Barsis. It also doesn't work with Klee and Diluc since they shatter, and hits that shatter will not melt. I think the best change that could come for forward melt is a cryo unit with high uptime and fast off-field cryo application. Ideally as fast or even faster than that of a C6 Kaya, while also not requiring you to be so close to the enemy. Probably something like a pyro zinc show. I mean a cryo zinc show. Now the last problem I have with cryo is that it doesn't have any Dendro reactions. I really don't understand why, considering Hydro got massively improved with Dendro, and Hydro was already in an excellent position even before Dendro. Cryo needed a buff way more than Hydro. I've seen people argue that the reason it doesn't interact with Dendro at all is so that you can have it coexisting as an aura with Dendro, but let's be real, right now that isn't very useful. And even then, it could still be able to do that while still coexisting with Dendro as an aura. As an example, Quicken lets you have both Electro and Dendro as an aura, and there's still a reaction there. So there's no excuse why Cryo couldn't have done something similar. So, if Cryo were to react with Dendro, how would I make the reaction work? I think just making it something simple like maybe, I don't know, 15% defense shred from it would be enough. Or maybe lowering Cryo and Dendro resistance. Just something simple and reasonably strong would be enough. If you guys have any specific ideas for what this could be, let me know in the comments. But I would also give it a Bloom reaction, like how Electro has Hyper Bloom and Pyro has Bargain. To make it unique compared to Hyper Bloom and Bargain, I would have it work like this. When Cryo comes into contact with a Bloom Seed, the seed will home in at an enemy the way Hyper Bloom does, except it will be split into two different hits that are spaced out about 0.6 seconds apart, and each hit will deal half the damage of a Bloom or a Bargain, so overall it does the same damage, but each individual hit is half. If there is more than one enemy, the two hits will also prioritize going after different targets. So the reaction will be doing total the same amount of damage as Hyper Bloom or Bargain, but the spacing out of it and it prioritizing different targets would help it get around the Bloom ICD, giving it a unique factor compared to Hyper Bloom and Bargain. I think giving Cryo Dendro reactions like this would have gone a long way to improving it. But yeah, overall, I think that's everything I have to say about Cryo. Overall, I do think it's the second worst element in the game, but I do want to make it clear that when I say this about Cryo, my opinion is still that it's very well ahead of Gia regardless. But if you liked today's video, please be sure to give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Once again, I am really hoping to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of this year. Also, please be sure to leave a comment below letting me know your thoughts. Thanks. Bye.